He is not a whistleblower by temperament. He is not a dissident, not a protester, not a man who sought out a Senate hearing room. Major Hal Knight is a radar operator from Arkansas who kept meticulous logs because that is what radar operators do. And in the summer of 1973, sitting before the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee, he describes in flat, exact language without drama 2 sets of records, the real ones which he kept locked in a safe, and the false ones which he filed with the Pentagon for 14 months. The room goes quiet. Because what Knight has just described is not a rogue officer's mistake. It is a system, designed, approved, and maintained at the highest levels of the United States military to hide a war that Congress never voted for. This is the story of Operation Menu. 3. 630 B-52 sorties over a country the United States was not officially at war with. 14 months of bombing runs that, on paper, never happened. And the one man whose logbooks proved they did. To understand why the Nixon administration needed Cambodia bombed in secret, you have to understand what Cambodia was in early 1969. It was officially neutral. Prince Norodom Sihanouk had maintained that neutrality since 1954, a careful, precarious balance that kept his small country out of the war consuming his neighbors. But Cambodia's eastern provinces, the stretch of jungle and river basin running along the South Vietnamese border, had become something else entirely. North Vietnamese Army base areas, designated by American intelligence as Base Area 352 and 53, 354, 367, 740, and COSVN, the Central Office for South Vietnam, the NVA's field headquarters, were operating openly inside Cambodian territory. American commanders had known this for years. They had been requesting permission to strike those sanctuaries for years. Every request had been denied. Bombing a neutral country without congressional authorization was, legally and politically, a line that could not be crossed. Richard Nixon crossed it 11 days after his inauguration. Nixon and National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger believed that a sustained bombing campaign against the NVA base areas in Cambodia would accomplish 2 things: reduce the pressure on American and South Vietnamese forces inside South Vietnam, and signal to Hanoi that the new administration was willing to escalate beyond anything Johnson had done. The problem was not the strategy. The problem was the politics. Congress had not authorized it. The American public had not been told. The Cambodian government, in the person of Sihanouk himself, had not officially consented, though back-channel signals suggested he would not loudly object if the strike stayed quiet. The solution the White House and the Pentagon arrived at was not to seek authorization. It was to build a system that made the strikes invisible. The system had a name inside the Air Force: dual reporting. And the man who built the machinery for it on the ground, and the man who would eventually dismantle it with his testimony, was not a general. He was a major. Hal Knight was born in 1932 in Arkansas. He was career Air Force, a ground radar operator, the kind of officer who spent his working life guiding aircraft to their targets from a console rather than flying them. By 1969, he was stationed at a radar site in South Vietnam, part of the network that coordinated B-52 arc light strikes, the massive high-altitude bombing runs that were the bluntest instrument in the American arsenal. Knight was good at his job. He was precise, methodical, and not given to asking questions above his pay grade. When the orders came down in the spring of 1969 explaining the new reporting procedure for a certain category of strike, he followed them. The procedure worked like this. When a B-52 cell was tasked to strike a target inside Cambodia, the radar operators received 2 sets of coordinates. The real target, the actual Cambodian grid reference, came through one channel. A false target, a coordinate inside South Vietnam, came through another. The crews were briefed on the real target verbally, in person. After the strike, the paperwork, the bomb damage assessment, the mission report, the targeting record, was filed against the false South Vietnamese coordinate. The real coordinate went into Knight's safe. Every crew involved was instructed not to discuss the mission. The official record showed an arc light strike inside South Vietnam. The real strike had been 60 miles west inside a country the United States was not at war with. Knight kept both sets of records for 14 months. From March 1969 through May 1970, across 6 sub-operations given the names of Sunday dinners. Breakfast, lunch, snack, dinner, dessert, and supper, collectively Operation Menu. 3,630 B-52 sorties dropped approximately 110,000 tons of bombs on Cambodian territory. Not one of those missions appeared in the official record. The false reports filed with the Pentagon showed all of them as South Vietnamese targets. On paper, the campaign did not exist. Here is what nobody asked Hal Knight at the time: whether he thought any of this was legal. He was a major. He followed orders. That is not a justification. It is a fact about how military institutions work and how systems of concealment sustain themselves. The people who designed the dual reporting procedure were not rogue operators. They included the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Earl Wheeler, and Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird's office. The Congressional Defense Committees were not informed. A small number of senior senators were given verbal briefings so vague they amounted to nothing. The system held for over a year because everyone inside it either had a reason to protect it or no leverage to expose it. The first crack came from outside the military entirely on May 9, 1969, just weeks after the bombing began. New York Times reporter William Beecher published a story reporting that the United States was bombing Cambodia. The story was accurate. It did not produce the political firestorm the White House feared. The public response was muted, but Nixon and Kissinger's response was not muted at all. Kissinger, convinced the story had come from a leak inside the NSC, authorized the FBI to wiretap the phones of his own staff members. 13 NSC aides and 4 journalists, including Beecher. Those wiretaps, illegal and undisclosed, would later become part of the articles of impeachment drawn up against Richard Nixon. But in the spring of 1969, the system held. The bombing continued. What happened in the next 4 years inside Cambodia is a separate history and a catastrophic one. Sihanouk was overthrown in March 1970 by a US-backed coup that installed General Lon Nol. Nixon, freed of the neutrality fiction, publicly announced the Cambodian incursion on April 30, 1970, a ground invasion by American and South Vietnamese forces. The secret bombing, now no longer entirely secret, continued under a new name, Operation Freedom Deal. The bombing of Cambodia would not stop until Congress forced it to in August 1973 under the Case Church Amendment after an estimated 500,000 tons of bombs had been dropped on Cambodian soil across 4 years. The civilian death toll in Cambodia from American bombing is disputed by historians, but credible estimates range from 50,000 to 150,000. The chaos and destruction the bombing caused in the Cambodian countryside is documented by historians including Ben Kiernan as a significant factor in the conditions that allowed the Khmer Rouge to recruit and eventually seize power in 1975. None of that was in Hal Knight's safe. What was in Knight's safe were the targeting logs, the real coordinates. The proof in the spring of 1973, a military journalist named Seymour Hersh. The same reporter who had broken the My Lai story began following leads on the secret bombing. His reporting, combined with congressional investigators already pulling at threads from the Watergate investigation, surfaced Knight's name. Knight, by then back in the United States, was contacted. He confirmed what he knew. He turned over his records. On July 16, 1973, Major Hal Knight testified before the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee. He described the dual reporting system in the precise procedural language of a man who had spent his career writing targeting logs. He named the procedure. He described the 2 sets of coordinates. He explained where the real records went. He was not angry. He was not dramatic. He answered every question put to him. The senators in the room understood by the end of his testimony that what he was describing was not an administrative irregularity. It was a systematic falsification of military records submitted to Congress, maintained for 14 months, involving thousands of individual missions. General Creighton Abrams, the commander of U.S. forces in Vietnam for most of the period in question, testified that he had not known about the dual reporting system. That claim was disputed by other testimony and has been questioned by historians. Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger, who had replaced Laird, ordered an investigation. The Air Force confirmed the dual reporting system had existed. No one was court-martialed for it. No senior officer faced criminal charges. The Air Force concluded that the falsification of records, while improper, had been carried out under orders from the civilian chain of command, which meant the accountability, if any existed, lay with officials who were no longer in office or who were already consumed by Watergate. General John Lavelle, who had been separately relieved of command of the 7th Air Force in 1972 for authorizing his own set of unauthorized strikes in North Vietnam. A distinct but related scandal involving falsified damage reports was used in some of the subsequent public discussion as a kind of partial explanation, a suggestion that the record falsification was aberrant rather than systemic. It was not aberrant. The menu dual reporting system predated Lavelle's strikes by 3 years and operated at a level of authority far above him. Hal Knight received no punishment for his role in the system. He also received no commendation for his testimony. He was quietly separated from the Air Force and returned to private life in Arkansas. His logbooks, the real ones, became part of the congressional record. They were declassified in stages over the following decades. Senator Harold Hughes of Iowa, who sat on the subcommittee and pushed the hardest for a full accounting, spent the remainder of his single Senate term pressing for greater congressional oversight of military operations. He did not seek re-election in 1974. He later became an ordained minister, Robert McNamara, whose tenure as Secretary of Defense ended in 1968, before MENU began. Nonetheless laid much of the institutional groundwork for the kind of compartmentalized operations that made MENU possible. He lived until 2009. In his 1995 memoir, he wrote that he had been wrong about Vietnam. He did not address the bombing of Cambodia. Nixon resigned the presidency on August 9, 1974, 14 months after Knight's testimony, driven from office by Watergate. The secret bombing of Cambodia was among the charges considered in the impeachment inquiry, though not among those formally voted on by the House Judiciary Committee. The Case Church Amendment, which ended all American bombing in Southeast Asia in August 1973, passed the House 231 to 177. It was the first time in the war that Congress had used its power of the purse to directly halt a military operation. Hal Knight's logbooks made that vote possible. He did not set out to end a war. He set out to keep accurate records. And it turned out that in a system designed to make 3,630 bombing missions disappear, accurate records were the most dangerous thing in the room. This video is a dramatization for storytelling purposes, based on real historical events and real figures. Some dialogue, interior detail, and scene sequence have been artistically reconstructed. The core events, operation menu, the dual reporting system, Major Knight's Senate testimony, the Case Church Amendment, and the documented fates of the figures named here are drawn from the historical record, including declassified Air Force documents, the 1973 Senate Armed Services Subcommittee hearings, and the reporting of Seymour Hersh and William Beecher. Viewers are encouraged to consult primary sources. If you found this story interesting, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Drop a like if you learned something new, and leave a comment telling me which overlooked operation from the Vietnam War you think deserves its own video.